favorite parables. When I was the chair of the board of directors at Camp Nowesca, I actually lifted up this illustration when I spoke to annual conference to talk about what our camp was going through. Then I shared this parable the first time that I had an opportunity to preach in Africa. When I was in Ghana, I lifted up this illustration to say that life throws a lot at us. Sometimes we have to find a way to manage. This has to be probably one of my favorite stories. I'm sure many of you have heard this, at least some version or other, but this is how I remember it, and this is the way I like to share it. There's a parable about a farmer and an old mule, and the mule falls into the farmer's well. And the farmer hears this braying, or whatever mules do when they fall into a well, and kind of comes up and sees the old mule down there, and kind of assesses the situation and realizes that the mule and the well is not worth saving. So he calls up his neighbors, and they all bring their shovels, and they decide that they're going to get this poor old mule out of its misery. So they start taking shovels of dirt and just kind of pile it in there. At first, the mule just goes hysterical. But then, after receiving one blow and another blow and another blow, begins to get this thought. What if I shake it off and step up? And so this goes on. Every time it receives a blow of dirt on its back, he shakes it off and steps up. Blow after blow after blow. The old mule just kind of shakes it off and steps up. Blow after blow, he shakes it off and steps up. Blow after blow, he shakes it off, steps up, to the point where he has packed down so much dirt that he's finally able to walk out of the well into freedom. Of course, the meaning of the parable is what likely would have buried him actually became a blessing. And it all depends on how we handle the adversity. Today is the final mile of the final mile. Our sermon series about Thomas Hall, who began his journey in his home state of Montana. He then went down into Wyoming and then a little bit into South Dakota, traveled through our portion of Nebraska, continuing on down to Kansas, Oklahoma, until the final state of Texas. Now, we've noticed that his final mile is brutal. Not only is Texas a big state, and I'll tell you, those that painted this said that this is only half the state. They could only get half of it on there. But it just seems like that each blog entry here in the final mile is like dirt being piled on his back. He's got to change directions. He goes down different highways. He accepts rides from strangers. He gets stuck in cities. It's just one thing after another. But today Thomas ends his journey. Now his goal has always been Del Rio, Texas, right down here on the U.S.-Mexico border. So, in light of that opening illustration that I shared with you, will Thomas be buried by the dirt that falls on him, or will he shake it off and step up and out of the well? Let's listen and read his final blog entry. The rain came down and the floods came up. On days 30 through 38, I faced the full devastation of rain in Texas. Rain had been falling prior to my arrival and continued unabated through the rest of my travel schedule. No matter where I turned, whether small cafes, diners, convenience pubs, locals could only talk weather. Rightly so, I had witnessed firsthand the devastation of the land. I pedaled past roads that had been baptized full immersion into oblivion, 10 feet beneath the red, foamy water. Many secondary roads had simply ceased to exist, leaving huge holes where they had once supported tractors and combines. Fields that once held the promise of a bumper crop had now become a haven for aquatic birds and amphibians. And the mosquitoes thrive in all of the watery change. The further south in Texas I pedaled, the more water devastation I witnessed. I was finally poised to make a quick dash toward the finish line. I focused on La Mesa. If you're looking on the map, La Mesa is right here. Then I would go on to Big Springs, and from there to San Angelo, finally reaching Del Rio on the U.S.-Mexico border. The rain would not allow me passage. The road to La Mesa was closed, so I took a 70-mile detour only to discover that I was headed for a river that had overflooded its bank, the Rio Grande, making passage to Del Rio impossible for up to 2 weeks. As I write, emergency agencies are evacuating the people in and around Del Rio. I now realized with the detours and delays as I proceeded south, I was moving further from civilization and from any airport that could get me and the bike back to Montana. It's an act of God, several locals pontificated with the air of seasoned agricultural theologians when they learned that I was trying to bicycle to Del Rio. You can't get down there. So after 38 days, I decided that God would allow me to conclude my journey that I had begun back on June 1st, even if I couldn't get to Del Rio. So at day 38, I made the decision to return home. I'm going to pause here in his blog entry. We have to acknowledge Thomas doesn't make it. You know, in our culture, we believe in happy endings. We believe in completing what we started. And this really runs counter to what we thought, what we expected when we first started his journey way back last summer. Now, we knew that Thomas was going to have it tough. But to not be allowed to finish his journey, I'll tell you, this is a tough read. It's like the dirt just kept falling on him. But you know, that donkey just doesn't take the blows, does he? He takes the blows, he shakes it off, and he steps up. Let me conclude his blog entry now. The entire last day on the road as I made my way to Odessa, the rain pelted and the wind blew just like in Jesus' parable about the wise and unwise architects that built on bedrock and sand, respectively. A lot of truth in that little story. Everything in Texas rainscape that wasn't anchored into something solid simply floated away, fell over, or dissolved. A biker's take on the parable is that rain happens even in the dry Texas outback. So use wisdom on the foundation of the road you're really traveling on. For me, one of the best choices I ever made was to become a follower of Jesus, the one who saves and gives joy, mission, and who can turn a simple bike ride into an adventure of a lifetime in which every spin of the pedal helps to change the world, one kid at a time. I told you that I shared that parable of the donkey, of the mule that fell in the well when I preached in Africa. I still remember my time with that incredible church that is part of our independent Methodist body. Now for me, the most fascinating part was connecting with a church that has this common Methodist background, but just is on a different country, or a different continent. Now I knew that there would be differences. The Methodists over in Ghana, they come out of the British Methodist system. So if you know your church history, you know that we got our start out of the Revolutionary War. But the British Methodists, they didn't start until 20 years later after John Wesley passes away. And so not only were they part of the British Methodist system, they've only been independent for about 60 years. Now I knew that we had this common heritage, this common background, but since the 1700s, we've kind of gone our own separate directions. So when I was getting ready to preach there in Africa, I thought about lifting up a phrase that comes from our common founder, John Wesley. And that phrase is, preach faith until you have it, and when you have it, you will preach faith. You see, Wesley was a man who struggled with faith. He was a man who knew a lot about faith. He preached a lot about faith. He wrote about faith profusely in his writings. But faith was something that he struggled with. He was a man with many doubts. For example, right after he was newly ordained in the Church of England, he was sent to here in the American colonies, to the colony of Georgia. Now his goal was to preach to the Native Americans. And he believed that all he had to do was just open up the Bible, open up the Book of Common Prayer, and all these Native Americans would convert to Christianity. Well, as the story goes, the Indians, they really liked him, but no one converted. And I think for Wesley, it was kind of like the dirt just kept falling. Well, that was unsuccessful, so he's sent to Virginia. And when he goes up to this colony in Virginia, now this is a colony. This is frontiersmen. This is not cheery old England, and they're not following the proper procedures. And so for him, he got quite frustrated. I think for Wesley, it was like the dirt just kept falling. And if you know your story of Wesley, when Wesley fell in love with someone in Virginia, and he asked her to marry him, and she said no. And so when she came up for communion, Wesley said, no, I'm not going to give you communion. And her dad was the colonial governor, and he said, why don't you sail back onto cheery old England? And I think for Wesley, it felt like the dirt kept falling. When he was on that boat and he was traveling back over to England, a storm came up. And he thought he was going to die. And one of his traveling companions came up to him and said, John, don't you know that God loves you? John didn't have an answer for that. It was like the dirt just kept falling. But then on May 24th, 280 years ago this week, John Wesley was attending a Bible study on Aldersgate Street, there in London, England. And he said that he felt his heart strangely warmed. And he knew that God loved him. And in that moment, Wesley said it almost like he was implying that he took the blows, he shook it off, and he stepped up. Today is Memorial Day weekend. And if you're like me, you probably looked out at your yard and your garden and you realized, oh my gosh, there is so much to do. And maybe you're thinking, the dirt just keeps on falling. Or maybe it's not your yard. Maybe you're at your workplace and you look around and you realize, I don't have any friends here anymore. And your boss is demanding more work for you in the same amount of time and the same amount of pay. And you look up and you realize the dirt just keeps falling. Or maybe you keep hearing these stories about how the economy is improving. But you look at your own pocketbook and you look at your own future and you're thinking, I'm not seeing any of this. And for you, the dirt just keeps on falling. Or maybe you look over at that devotional guide book. The one that you said that you would read every day last year, and it's kind of collecting dust on the coffee table. And you realize that your relationship with God is getting a little bit farther away, and at this point you're thinking that the dirt just keeps falling. Or maybe you're in a relationship that's not growing, that's just not going anywhere, and it's not taking you where you need to go, when you're thinking, the dirt keeps falling. Or maybe you're in retirement, and you're thinking, this is not what I was expecting. We don't have the money to travel like we planned on. Our body just has all these aches and pains. You're on a first-name basis with every healthcare worker in the valley, and you feel like the dirt just keeps falling. You don't like this time. This is not where you thought God was supposed to get you to be. The dirt keeps falling. You keep saying to yourself, well, this isn't fair. We didn't ask to be in this hole. We didn't ask for this dirt to be fallen. We didn't put ourselves into this situation. This is not what we signed up for. It doesn't matter because guess what? The dirt keeps falling. There's a reason that I chose to lift up this illustration when I was in Africa. Because when I preached in Africa, it was 1 week removed from a very ugly situation that I had here in America with the church. And so I was beginning to question my own call to be a pastor. I was experiencing my own dirt fall moment. But the problem was I had to preach. And so that's why I chose this text from Wesley. Preach faith until you have it. And when you have it, you will preach faith. And I was going to do this even as the dirt was falling all around me. And then we went to Tweefel-Prassel. So some of you probably remember at Christmas time, we had this thing called Advent Conspiracy, where we raised money. We took our Christmas offering, we gave it to an organization called TRIACO, which stands for Tweefel Rural Youth and Women Concerned. And we were going to see the Clean Water Project that we were sponsoring there. And But it was a long trip. It was about a 4-hour drive from where we were staying, and the road condition was terrible, and the jungles was getting thicker. And this church, they had this guy in the church that everyone called Uncle Sam. He was kind of like a Ted Miller type of guy over there. And as we were going into the jungle, he turned to us and he says, "We're in the middle of nowhere." And we thought, you know you're in a dirtfall moment when an African says you're in the middle of nowhere. And then we met Matthew Ido, who was the project coordinator for Triaco, and we started following him, and the jungle got thicker. And then the best line came from that Uncle Sam character. He turns to us, he says, "Now we're in the middle of nowhere." And as the road went from just asphalt that was falling apart and rocks and gravel to just 2 ruts, and the jungle got thicker, Uncle Sam said to us, "We're in the middle." Well, you get the point. Then we finally get to this remote village. I mean, there's no electricity, mud huts, thatched roofs. We were told about that they have this black fly whose bite is so serious that nobody can sleep outside. And then we're shown the well, still under construction. And the reason I chose this picture, see this guy right here? As I'm taking a picture of him, he's taking a picture of me with his phone. So I just did have it up. But anyway, we're shown the well when we're there. And I don't know how they knew it, but all these people started showing up out of the jungle. And Matthew Ido begins to describe to them why we came all the way from Nebraska to their little remote part of Ghana. And I'll tell you what, their response of gratitude was so moving that I instantly knew why. This is why we are there. This is why we're the church. This is why we are in ministry. I was so overwhelmed with the thought that this would have never happened if it wasn't for being connected by God, being connected by the church, being connected by a God that put all of this together. I cannot describe to you the feeling that came over me. I still kind of get tingles about it just several years later. This is why we are the church. This is why we're in mission to people halfway around the world. This because God knows there are going to be valleys that we go through. There are going to be holes that we fall into. God knows that we are going to have challenges like what Thomas Hall goes through. God knows that there are going to be dirt moments in our life. God knows that we will have moments where we reach the end of our journey and it's not where we expect it to be. But time and time again, God reminds us to take the blows, shake it off, and step up. Thomas solidifies this when he says, "For me, one of the best choices I ever made was becoming a follower of Jesus. The one who saves and gives joy, mission, and who can turn a simple bike ride into an adventure of a lifetime, in which every spin of the pedal helps to change the world one kid at a time." You know, when I look at this final statement from him, I realize this is a foundation statement. This is a bedrock when the rains fall, when the dirt comes down, when we lack the faith to preach it. This is a foundation that even when we end one journey, we shake it off and we step up for another one. Donald Schmidt talks about this in a poem that he writes about his relationship with God. The poem is called "I Ran." The poem goes like this. "I got so tired of the way things were, I just started running. No one listens to me. I cried and I started running. I'm the only one who cares around here. I cried and started running. If I stick around here, I'll go crazy. I cried and I started running. No one understands me. I cried and I started running. And I ran and I ran and I ran. I ran for days and weeks and months and years. I ran into new problems and I kept running. And when I could run no longer, I stopped. And I tried to catch my breath and I yelled out. I said, God, listen to me. I want answers. I want some respect. I want some attention. I want. And I sat down to wait for an answer. And I waited. And I said, come on, God. I'm waiting. You owe me an explanation. And I want it now. And I heard nothing. And I said, that's it, God. I'm giving you one more chance. You better give me some answers or else I'll. And I heard nothing. And I waited. And the silence was deafening. And then I heard laughter. It started small, growing louder. It was my own voice. I was laughing at myself. And then in the midst of the laughter and the silence, I heard a gentle voice, and the gentle voice said, "Are you ready to listen?" And I heard God speak. Are you ready to hear God speak?
After they had set a day to meet with him, they came to him at his lodgings in great number. From morning until evening he explained the matter to them, testifying to the kingdom of God, and trying to convince them about Jesus, both from the law of Moses and from the prophets. Some were convinced by what he had said, while others refused to believe. So they disagreed with each other, and as they were leaving, Paul made one further statement. The Holy Spirit was right in saying to your ancestors through the prophet Isaiah, "Go to this people and say, you will indeed listen, but never understand. And you will indeed look, but never perceive. For the people's heart has grown dull, and their ears are hard of hearing. And they have shut their eyes so that they might not look with their eyes and listen with their ears and understand with their heart and turn, and I would heal them. Let it be known to you then that this salvation of God has been sent to the Gentiles. They will listen."
Thank you, Ben. These are the final words of Paul. Now, much like the journey of Thomas Hall, we've been following the journey of Paul, and we conclude today as he preaches for the final time in Rome. It's all about listening to God. And if you notice, that's something that we have been doing throughout this sermon series, listening to the very acts of the Spirit. In both good times and bad, and moments when we feel like the dirt is falling on us, and in those moments we step up and we get out. Sometimes we need to hear passages like this one. We need to be reminded of why we are the church, why God's presence is still alive in and around the world, and why God's people cannot be put down even when that dirt has fallen all around us. You know, I thought of this passage when I remembered my time in Ghana, in a country that we considered to be our mission territory. Now, when I was in Africa, I learned all about the presence of God. I learned about how Methodism existed, and especially in this former colony of Britain. And you think about it, this is a church that was run by the British up until about 1961. They're now an independent body. They started as a mission of Europe. But now Godson, and Godson is the pastor that we've been donating money to for his family, he told me that they are in mission to us. According to the latest statistics that I could find, this blows my mind. The Ghana Methodist Church is active in 28 states. That's 28 American states, with a total membership right now of 2,000 members. You see, we did not go to Ghana to teach them about the gospel. The gospel is now being taught to us. When we went over there, we had worship every night. We prayed before meals. We prayed after meals. We prayed when we got in the car. We prayed when the car stopped. And when the car broke down, they said, "Oh, it's okay. Everything comes from God." We did not go to Africa to teach them about faith. We had faith shown to us. You see, the foundation of God is strong with our partners in ministry. This is why we're in mission to people in Africa. This is why we're in mission to people on Country Club Road. This is why we're in mission to people that are building a home through Habitat for Humanity. This is why we're in mission to our campground just down the road. It builds our foundation and reminds us why we are the church. In life, that dirt's going to continue to fall. But each time, what do? You know it. You know the story. You take the blows, you shake it off, and you step up. It's another opportunity to preach faith. And maybe someday, have faith taught to us. I want to conclude with a story by Bruce Larson. Bruce, in his book, Ask Me to Dance, talks about a member of his congregation that grew up in another country. And so he said that of her face sparkled and the living water of the Spirit flowed out of her soul to all around her. Well, Bruce decided to invite her to an evangelism conference. As they got there, there was all kind of pamphlets and documents and ways to using demographic studies to reach the unchurched. And so they sat down and they were listening to all these people talk about evangelism. And then finally some of the speakers, they kind of looked at this woman and they said, can you tell us about the church in your country? Can you tell us why the church, what you guys did in your country? And this woman was a bit hesitant. And then she finally spoke up and she said, well, we never gave pamphlets to people because we never had any. We just showed people by our life an example of what it's like to be a Christian. And when they can see for themselves, they want to be a Christian too. And when I think of that, I think of the words of John Wesley. Preach faith until you have it. And when you have it, you preach faith. Wesley experienced some blows in his life, some dirt fall moments, but he shook them off and he stepped up. Even when he didn't have the faith, he knew it was coming. My friends, we end a journey today, but we start another. Next week, we're going to be starting, and all throughout the summer, we're going to be talking, we're going to get a heavy dose of faith in a sermon series that we're calling Faith and the Patriarch. We're going to learn that these witnesses in the Bible need faith to get through some dirt fall moments in their life. Yet they take the blows, and like us, they step it up, and they become the foundation of the church